There is a quote by Carl Jung that very few people truly understand until they have lived through it themselves. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. Take a moment to pause and think about that, because there are certain losses that do not make a person realize what they have lost right away, especially for someone with narcissistic tendencies. When a relationship ends, they often do not feel as though they have just lost something precious. On the contrary, they believe they still have everything under control, that the other person was merely an old chapter, a temporary emotion, a name that could easily be replaced by someone more attractive, fresher, and easier to conquer. But time always has its own way of exposing the truth. When new relationships no longer bring the same depth as before, when admiration becomes shallow, like stage lights slowly fading after a performance, when new people leave more quickly, and the room that was once filled with applause suddenly becomes terrifyingly silent, that is when they begin to silently face a truth they once denied. The person who truly loved them may never appear a second time. And this is exactly where Carl Jung enters the story. Jung believed that every human being carries within them a hidden part, something he called the shadow. It is everything we do not want to admit about ourselves. The fear of abandonment, the feeling of emptiness, the longing to be loved that our proud ego refuses to say out loud. A narcissist is not someone without emotions. They are simply so afraid of their own emotions that they build an entire castle just to bury them. The mask they wear, what Jung called the persona, is so perfect that even they begin to believe it is their real face. They project their own inner lack onto others, demanding that other people fill a void that only they themselves can heal. And when the only person who ever saw through that mask, the person who loved even the darkest parts of them, walks away, they lose far more than a relationship. They lose the only mirror that ever reflected their true self. In today's video, we will walk together into the journey that Jung called individuation, the process in which a person confronts their own shadow, removes the mask, and, for the first time in their life, dares to love fully. Because the truth Jung wanted to tell all of us is very simple, yet deeply painful. Whatever we refuse to look at within ourselves, we will meet again outside of ourselves in the form of a loss. Stay until the end of this video, because the final part may change the way you see yourself. Part 1. At first, they believe you can be replaced. The moment a relationship comes to an end, a narcissistic person rarely collapses in the way ordinary people do. There is no quiet stillness, no sudden emptiness in the chest. Instead, there is a strange kind of liveliness. They rush forward, almost desperately, searching for another gaze, another compliment, another person willing to look up at them with admiration, as if by filling the space quickly enough, they will not have to hear the echo of what has just left. Because to them, loneliness is not merely sadness. Loneliness is an accusation. It whispers that perhaps they are not as perfect as the mask they have always worn. And to silence that whisper, they need proof, a new person to prove that they are still charming, still valuable, still the one in control of the emotional game. Every answered message, every captivated glance, every new form of attention becomes, to them, like a painkiller, soothing something they themselves do not dare to name. In the story they weave for themselves, you become smaller. You become too emotional, too deeply attached, too fragile to stop hurting yourself. And because you are seen as too vulnerable, they also assume you are too easy to replace. They tell themselves that the love you once gave was nothing special, that out there, hundreds of people would be willing to love them in the same way, perhaps even more passionately, more blindly, and with fewer demands. They devalue the gift, so they do not have to suffer from having dropped it. But this is exactly what Carl Jung would point out. All those words are not the truth. They are defense mechanisms. They are a shield hastily raised to protect a part inside them that is beginning to crack, even though they do not allow themselves to admit it. Jung called that part the shadow, the storage place of everything human beings reject about themselves, the fear of abandonment, the bottomless feeling of emptiness, the longing to be loved unconditionally, which the proud ego would never allow them to speak aloud. A narcissistic person is not someone without emotions. They are simply so afraid of their own emotions that they build an entire fortress to imprison them. And when you leave, The first cracks begin to appear in that fortress. So they run, they replace, they project their own inner lack onto someone else, demanding that a stranger fill the void that only they themselves can heal. Every new person is a desperate attempt to prove that you were never important. Because if you truly were important, then losing you would become a real loss. And a real loss would force them to feel. They would have to hurt, and they would have to face the mirror they have spent their entire life avoiding. That is the most painful paradox of the narcissistic person. The harder they try to prove you are replaceable, the more they unconsciously admit the opposite. People do not build walls around something meaningless. They only build walls when there is something inside worth hiding and something they are afraid to look at directly. Because deep beneath all the carefully staged indifference, there is a truth they are not ready to face. You were not someone who loved them because of the mask. You were one of the rare people who saw through it, who touched the real person inside, the most vulnerable part, the part even they had never dared to love and still chose to stay. And someone like that, Jung would say, can never be easily replaced. Part 2. Time exposes the hidden dangers of new relationships. Then the narcissistic person enters new relationships, and at first, everything shines like fireworks. They are noticed, adored, desired. They glow in the eyes of strangers, and in that moment, they almost believe they were right, that you really were just a name that could be erased and written over. But fireworks, by their very nature, never burn for long. Because what fascinates people in the beginning, the confident appearance, the carefully polished charm, the aura of someone who seems to need no one, is actually only the thinnest outer layer. Carl Jung called this layer the persona, the mask we wear to present ourselves to the world. A mask can make someone fall for you in the first few weeks, but it can never keep a person through the winter, because sooner or later, the shadow begins to appear. Instability starts leaking through the cracks. Sudden coldness without explanation. Emotional cycles that lift the other person to the peak and then drop them into the abyss. A need for control disguised as love. And the people who come later, those who were drawn to the light, have no reason to remain in the darkness. They do not owe the narcissistic person patience. They do not understand, nor do they want to go deep enough to understand. More importantly, they do not choose to stay. They simply leave in silence, leaving the room empty even faster than it was filled. And it is here that something the narcissistic person never allowed themselves to consider begins to creep in. A silent comparison. Not everyone stays as long as you did. Not everyone digs deep enough to find the real person beneath all the defenses. Not everyone is gentle enough in the face of instability, patient enough in the face of coldness, or forgiving enough toward things that no one should have been forced to endure. The new people leave the moment things become difficult, while you once stayed for a very long time, longer than what was reasonable, so long that the narcissistic person mistook it for something guaranteed. Jung once said that we only truly recognize the value of light after standing too long in the darkness. And for the first time, the narcissistic person begins to feel this not through words, but through a nameless, lingering emptiness. They have not admitted it. Perhaps they will never admit it out loud. But that comparison has already been planted, and it will quietly grow. Every person who leaves becomes another mirror raised before their face, reflecting a truth that becomes clearer each time. What they once had, what they once took lightly, was never as ordinary as they kept telling themselves. And the shallowness of what comes after, paradoxically, becomes the most accurate measure of the depth of what was lost. Part 3. They realize that genuine love is rare and hard to find. There is a truth that takes a narcissistic person a very long time to reach, and once they reach it, they can no longer avoid it. What made you different was never that you were weaker than others. That was only a distorted story they once told themselves in order to feel less guilty. What truly made you different was that you loved them with something very few people in this world can offer. Patience that was almost unconditional. Understanding that did not require them to explain themselves, and a steady belief in them even when they had stopped believing in themselves. You did not love the mask. This is the key. Carl Jung once said that most people connect only with each other's persona, the polished appearances, the carefully constructed images designed to impress. But you went further than that. You saw the trembling insecurity beneath the confidence. You recognized the unhealed wounds, the hidden chaos, the frightened child hiding behind the proud adult. You looked directly into their shadow, the part even they were terrified of, and you did not run away. You did what they had never dared to do for themselves. You believed that beneath all that brokenness, there was still a human being worthy of love and still capable of becoming better. But the narcissistic person, blinded by old wounds, misread everything. Your loyalty was treated as something obvious, like air, like something always there, and therefore not worth valuing. Your forgiveness was mistaken for weakness, for an invitation to test your limits one more time. They thought that someone who gave so much must be easy. They did not realize that giving like that was not weakness. It was a courageous choice, repeated every day by a heart that understood its cost very well. Jung called the journey of facing the truth about oneself the process of individuation, and it always begins with pain. Because in order to grow, a person is forced to look back at what they have dropped along the way. And one day, in the middle of shallow relationships that come and go, the narcissistic person will pause before a chilling realization. The very things they once took for granted were actually among the rarest things life could ever offer. Not everyone has patience. Not everyone gives understanding. And a person willing to love even the darkest parts of you, that person does not easily appear a second time. They will search. They will try to replace you. They will knock on one door after another, hoping to find again that feeling of being truly seen and completely accepted. But the more they search, the more they understand what Jung knew long ago. Some things, once lost, are not lost because we ran out of luck, but because from the very beginning, we did not know how to value the precious thing already in our hands. Part 4. When you become silent, their emotional power fades away. There is something very few people understand about the narcissistic person. What feeds them is not your love, it is your reaction. Because to them, your emotions, any emotions, are a form of fuel. When you are angry, they feel important. When you argue, they know they still have influence. When you blame them, cry, or beg for an explanation, they understand that they still occupy a place in your inner world. Even your pain confirms one thing to them: I still matter to this person. And as long as they still matter, they still feel a sense of control. This is the cruelest paradox of a relationship with a narcissistic person. The more intensely you react, the more you give them what they need. Every tear is another confirmation of their position. Every argument is a stage on which they can continue playing the central role. They are not afraid of your anger. They feed on it. They provoke it, because anger is still a string pulling you back toward them. But then there is one thing they truly fear, one thing that shakes their entire fortress from its foundation. It is when you become silent. Not the kind of silence used to punish, the kind that still secretly hopes they will come and comfort you. Not the kind of silence used to gain attention, the kind that still waits beneath the surface for a message, an apology, or a sign. But real silence. The silence that comes after your heart has passed through every storm and finally reached a quiet shore. It is the calmness of someone who has truly stepped out of the cycle, not through anger, but through peaceful release. Carl Jung spoke of a turning point in the journey of maturity. The moment a person withdraws the expectations and illusions they once projected onto others. For a long time, you placed upon the narcissistic person the hope that they would change, that if you loved them enough and remained patient long enough, they would become the person you believed they could be. You placed your peace in their hands, tying your emotions to the way they treated you. And that very thread of expectation was what kept you trapped in their orbit. True silence is the moment you cut that thread. It does not need any announcement. It says everything by itself. It says that you are no longer waiting. You no longer hope they will change. You no longer place your peace in someone else's hands. You have taken back the part of your soul you once gave away, and for the first time in a very long time, it belongs to you. And this is what destabilizes the narcissistic person. They can manipulate someone who is angry. They can pull back someone who is hurting. They can reclaim someone who is still waiting. But they are completely powerless before someone who is truly at peace. There is no door left to knock on, no button left to press, no wound left open for them to slip into. Jung believed that true power does not lie in controlling others, but in mastering oneself, and your silence is the declaration of that strength. It shows that you have reclaimed authority over your inner world, the very place where they once believed they had the privilege to rule. When they realize they can no longer control your reactions, a chilling truth begins to sink in. Their place in your life no longer exists, not because you pushed them away in rage, but because you quietly closed the door, without noise, without hatred, simply with certainty. And that is the kind of departure a narcissistic person can never reverse, because you did not leave through emotion, you left through freedom. Part 5. They become obsessed, not because they lost you, but because they cannot find the mature version of you anywhere else. Time passes. Years may have gone by, and the narcissistic person, who seemed to have forgotten, suddenly finds your image returning, not loudly, but quietly, like a mist slipping through the cracks of their mind when they least expect it. They do not remember you through clear regret. A narcissistic person rarely allows themselves to regret directly, because regret requires them to admit fault, and admitting fault is something their ego resists to the very end. Instead, they remember you through silent, creeping comparisons that arrive uninvited. They remember how patient you were when the rest of the world had run out of patience with them. They remember the things you understood that no one else even cared to understand. And most of all, they remember the stability you once brought, that feeling of safety they took for granted when they still had it, only realizing how rare it was after losing it. Carl Jung once said that what we refuse to face within ourselves will return to us in the form of fate. And to the narcissistic person, you become exactly that, a figure that keeps returning, an invisible standard against which everyone after you is compared, and no one passes. But this is what unsettles them most deeply, deeper than longing, colder than regret. They understand that, even if they came back, they would never again meet the person they once lost, because you are no longer the person you used to be. You have changed, and that change is permanent. You have learned how to build boundaries where there used to be endless compromise. You have seen through the old patterns, idealization followed by devaluation, promises followed by abandonment, warmth given and then withdrawn like a punishment. You no longer confuse manipulation with love. You no longer mistake staged tears for genuine remorse. And most importantly, you no longer confuse their return with real change, because you now understand that people do not always come back because they have become better. Often, they return only because they could not find anyone else patient enough to endure what you once endured. Jung called the journey you have gone through individuation, the process in which a person integrates the broken parts of themselves, confronts the shadow, and emerges on the other side as a more whole and awakened being. Every wound you once suffered has become a lesson. Every act of forgiveness that was exploited has taught you when to stop forgiving. You did not become hardened. You became clear-sighted. And a heart that can both love deeply and see the truth clearly is something no manipulator can reach anymore. This is the most painful thing the narcissistic person must carry, and also the one thing they can never reverse. They did not only lose you, they lost the door back to the version of you who once loved them unconditionally. That person, the one who was willing to give without calculating, trust without guarding, stay without demanding, no longer exists. Not because you became cold, but because you became mature, and that maturity has forever closed the door they once walked through, whenever they pleased. They may find the old address, but no one lives in that house anymore. You are still there, still warm, still capable of loving more deeply than ever. But that love now has a gatekeeper. It is reserved for someone worthy, not for someone who only returns when they have no other options left. And that is the truth the narcissistic person will carry in silence. Some doors, once closed, are not closed because of hatred, but because the person inside has finally learned their own worth. You have changed, and that change is permanent. You have learned how to build boundaries where there used to be endless compromise. You have seen through the old patterns, idealization followed by devaluation, promises followed by abandonment, warmth given and then withdrawn like a punishment. You no longer confuse manipulation with love. You no longer mistake staged tears for genuine remorse. And most importantly, you no longer confuse their return with real change. Because you now understand that people do not always come back because they have become better. Often, they return only because they could not find anyone else patient enough to endure what you once endured. Jung called the journey you have gone through individuation, the process in which a person integrates the broken parts of themselves, confronts the shadow, and emerges on the other side as a more whole and awakened being. Every wound you once suffered has become a lesson. Every act of forgiveness that was exploited has taught you when to stop forgiving. You did not become hardened. You became clear-sighted. And a heart that can both love deeply and see the truth clearly is something no manipulator can reach anymore. This is the most painful thing the narcissistic person must carry, and also the one thing they can never reverse. They did not only lose you, they lost the door back to the version of you who once loved them unconditionally. That person, the one who was willing to give without calculating, trust without guarding, stay without demanding, no longer exists. Not because you became cold, but because you became mature, and that maturity has forever closed the door they once walked through, whenever they pleased. They may find the old address, but no one lives in that house anymore. You are still there, still warm, still capable of loving more deeply than ever. But that love now has a gatekeeper. It is reserved for someone worthy, not for someone who only returns when they have no other options left. And that is the truth the narcissistic person will carry in silence. Some doors, once closed, are not closed because of hatred, but because the person inside has finally learned their own worth. Because there is a quiet realization that will follow them for a very long time, perhaps for the rest of their life. A whisper that rises in the stillness of late nights, when all the applause has stopped, and the room contains only them and themselves. It tells them a truth that no busyness, no new relationship, no dose of attention can silence. Admiration, they can find again. Attraction, they can awaken again. A new relationship, they can begin at any time. But the feeling of being completely seen by another human being, of being understood in both their brightest light and deepest darkness, and still being chosen to stay, that feeling cannot be bought, found, or replaced. Carl Jung once wrote that the most terrifying loneliness is not being alone, but being surrounded by many people while no one truly sees you. And that is the sentence the narcissistic person unknowingly gives themselves. They may be surrounded by countless people, but all of those people only love the mask, the shining persona they perform for the world. The only person who ever passed through that mask, who touched the trembling real self beneath it and still did not turn away, has left. And they themselves pushed that person out of their life. This is what Jung called the return of what has been denied. Throughout life, the narcissistic person runs away from their shadow, denying their vulnerability, rejecting their need to be truly loved, pretending that they need no one at all. But what we deny does not disappear. It only waits. And one day, it returns in the form of a loss that can no longer be repaired. The shadow they spent their life running from finally finds them, not through an explosion of rage, but through a quiet, persistent, nameless emptiness. That is why the quietest karma in this world is not losing everything in front of other people. It is not public humiliation, nor a collapse that everyone witnesses. The quietest karma is simply the moment a person suddenly awakens, too late, to the fact that the person they once considered ordinary, the person they once believed could easily be replaced, the person they once treated as if they would always be available, was actually the rarest and most precious person life had ever given them. And that awakening does not come with a second chance. It comes alone, cold and silent, carrying the realization that the door has closed forever. That is why Jung believed the most important journey in a person's life is daring to look within, to face one's own shadow, before it forces us to pay with the most precious things we have. Because the final truth is both simple and deeply painful. We do not lose people because we run out of luck. We lose them because we failed to see their value while they were still right beside us. And if today you still have someone like that in your life, please do not wait until it is too late to understand how precious they truly are. And so, we have reached the final part of today's video. Before we say goodbye, Let us pause for a moment and allow everything we have just explored to settle within us. Because the deepest meaning of this story does not lie in whether the narcissist feels regret or not. Their regret, if it exists, no longer belongs to you. What truly matters, the only thing worth carrying with you as you leave this video, is that you have finally seen your own value. If you once loved completely, if you were once patient in a way others could never understand, if you stubbornly believed in the goodness within someone, even when they had stopped believing in themselves, then please remember this. That was never a sign of weakness. It was proof of a heart capable of loving more deeply than most people ever could. Carl Jung once said that where we stumble, there lies the treasure of our life. The wounds you once carried have taught you the most precious lesson of all. Deep love still needs boundaries, and kindness without limits is only an invitation to be exploited. When your devotion has been taken for granted too many times, walking away is not a failure. It is the moment you awaken. It is the moment you reclaim the soul you once gave away. And for the first time, place it back where it truly belongs, in your own hands. Because in the end, true strength was never about making someone suffer. Revenge is the game of those who are still emotionally chained. True strength, the kind of power Jung would call self-mastery, is when you no longer allow your life to revolve around someone who does not know how to value you. And the day you find peace within your own soul again, that is the most complete victory of all. A victory that needs no witness, no approval, and no recognition, because it belongs to you alone. The journey back to yourself is always the loneliest journey, but it is also the most worthwhile journey a person can ever take. If this video touched something within you, if there was a sentence that made you pause and reflect, please leave a like. That is how you help messages like this reach more people who need to hear them. And if you want to continue exploring the depths of human psychology with us through the lens of Carl Jung, do not forget to subscribe to the channel so you will not miss the journeys ahead. Leave a comment below. What have you learned about your own value? We read every line you share. Thank you for staying until the very last moment. I will see you again in the next video, and on the journey back to your true self.